Recording in progress.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Emilio David. I'm a lawyer and a law professor, and I'm speaking to you on behalf of the Legal Center for Palestine. The Legal Center for Palestine is a not-for-profit organization that was launched in 2021 in Toronto by a group of lawyers, legal academics, and advocates interested in using law to protect and advance Palestinian rights in Canada and beyond. Today, LCP carries out its mission through legal advocacy, research, stakeholder engagement, and policy consultation. The Legal Center for Palestine and Forensic Architecture, thank you for your interest. We have only 30 minutes in total, and therefore my intervention here will be short in order to give time to Omar Ferawati from Forensic Architecture to present its findings regarding the ongoing Israeli military campaign in Gaza. Thank you, Omar.
Hello, thanks for being here. My name is Omar Ferawati. I'm a senior researcher at Forensic Architecture, an academic research agency based in Goldsmiths, University of London in the UK. We investigate human rights violations using spatial and interdisciplinary methods that we've developed over the past 15 years. Our work has been submitted as evidence in national and international courts, including the European Human Rights Court, the International Criminal Court, and the International Court of Justice. We've been documenting and analyzing the conduct of the Israeli military since it began its campaign in Gaza in October 2023 in a series of public reports. Of which I was one of the leads. Our most significant project is a cartography of genocide, which includes an 827-page report produced at the request of the legal team representing South Africa at the ICJ. It also includes an online mapping database, which allows anyone to inspect the incidents we have verified, analyzed, and geolocated, and the patterns that we've observed. By patterns, we mean the order of repetition of same, similar, or related incidents at different times and places. These patterns indicate policies and objectives of Israel and the Israeli military, because in the overlap of conduct, we can read what's isolated and what is by design, what's random and what's part of a plan. In all our analysis, we have found and continue to find that Israel's conduct in Gaza indicates a systematic and organized campaign to destroy life, the conditions necessary for life, and life-sustaining infrastructure. We found this across our analysis of 6 areas of civilian life, including spatial control, which is the militarization of civilian space, forced displacement, aid, agriculture and water, medical infrastructure, and civilian infrastructure. Now, I urge everyone to read these reports in details as the situation on the ground in Gaza, particularly in Gaza City, is rapidly deteriorating. I will present our most recent findings about Israel's conduct in its invasion of Gaza City, as well as its role in the growing famine and starvation across Gaza, how these relate to one another, and how they relate to wider patterns of conduct by the Israeli military. Last week, after it began its invasion of Gaza City, Israel issued a forced displacement order to the entirety of northern Gaza, an area which currently has 1 million people sheltering there. This was the same evacuation order Israel issued 23 months ago at the beginning of its military campaign. It failed to forcibly displace Palestinians from northern Gaza then, and had since, we found, had been engaged in a process to make Gaza, and particularly northern Gaza, uninhabitable by dividing it, depriving it of aid, destroying essential infrastructure and services, and systematically leveling its urban fabric. Part of this process includes the frequent forced displacement of people over what are called humanitarian measures. These evacuation orders, which are repeatedly used, we find, as a tool of forced displacement throughout its campaign. Among other things, we found these to be contradictory and often leading people to places that were later struck by the Israeli military. Since Israel broke the ceasefire in March of this year, it has issued 63 evacuation orders across the Strip. Alongside those evacuation orders, which are indefinite, Israel's recently declared dangerous combat zone, in quotations, means that more than 90% of Gaza is a no-go zone for Palestinians. The remaining space is fragmented and continues to be attacked. In this map, we see that in the dozens of incidents that we've verified, we can see Israel's attacks have been everywhere, including inside and outside where they've told people to go. And when we look closer at those evacuation orders, how they happen, we find that after Palestinians, for example, returned to the north during the ceasefire earlier this year and built shelter camps there, Israel's renewed offensive suggests that they targeted exactly where displaced people were concentrated with these evacuation orders. We can see the places where there was the most displaced people were the places that were first told to evacuate. We've also seen hospital attacks more often when they sheltered displaced people. When we layer all these arrows of these evacuation orders together, we can see a tendency or a strategy to displace Palestinians from north to south and from east to west, where land is least arable and which does not have the services required to sustain and support life. This was concluded by the ICJ more than a year ago, and the concentration of people is growing there. As Israel began its invasion of Gaza City, most of the spaces Israel told Palestinians to go were within no-go zones, were within areas that were declared dangerous combat zones or evacuation areas. And the others were often uninhabitable, either the ruins of buildings or in some cases, literal garbage dumps. When we look at the mapping of destruction in Gaza City, we find it synonymous with the movement of the Israeli military, meaning that as the Israeli military is advancing into Gaza, it is leveling the entirety of its urban fabric. We see that this is happening particularly from three directions, as it squeezes people within Gaza to the coast and leaving them no place to go except to the south. And we can see the effect of that tendency to squeeze people by seeing densely populated tent camps in its path displaced within just 2 weeks. The invasion is moving toward a densely populated area of displaced people, indicating an intention to push them out of the city. People are moving there, setting up new camps, and the invasion is moving towards them and pushing them south. At the same time as its ground forces are advancing, Israel is continuing to bombard what remains of the city, beginning with its mostly residential high-rise buildings. While Israel claims these strikes to be precise, when we look at the ground invasion, we see a plan of systematic destruction. In the last 2 months, we see Israel erasing the fabric of the city. What we see here in red, just 2 months after the invasion accelerated, we see complete annihilation of urban fabric. When we take a closer look at one of these neighborhoods, we see how this unfolds. And we can see the systematic nature of this destruction that tells us the aim is displacement and permanent displacement at that. We can see in this area, for example, in March, dotted with tent camps in white, already heavily damaged. By 26th of July, we see Israeli troops and military bases with earth berms. We can also see that it has been emptied and already half of it has been leveled. The fact that they had established military bases and parked military vehicles for a long period of time tells us that they have control over this area. And what we see subsequently to that is a consequential or sequential destruction of this neighborhood. With Israeli tanks and bulldozers still visible, weeks later, we see the destruction spread and grow. It happens methodically and incrementally. And by the 19th of August, nothing remained of this neighborhood. And the Israeli troops that we had seen stationed there move on. Within just 3 weeks, this neighborhood was leveled and its very trace scraped from the earth. This is a strategy that tells us of an intention or a plan to make Gaza not only uninhabitable, but make it impossible to return to. This method of isolation, deprivation, expulsion, and systematic destruction is a military strategy we have observed Israel use throughout its campaign. In January earlier this year, before the ceasefire, Israel was building a new military corridor by destroying the built fabric of northern Gaza. Satellite images reveal to us widespread destruction, largely by controlled demolition in places that they were in control of, in Jabalia, Beit Lahia, and Beit Hanun. At the same time, we see an increase, an expansion of tent camps in Gaza City. This is the very place that they are now demolishing and displacing people once again, showing us this incremental north to south push of Palestinians towards the edge of Rafah and likely outside of Gaza completely. After Israel broke the ceasefire on March 18th, it ordered the entire city of Rafah to evacuate, with new military routes, as we see in red, growing, being carved out of its fabric at the same time. Satellite images from this month show us that these corridors are being carved through agricultural and urban spaces. In Rafah, we see how destruction, military infrastructure, and displacement were used to erase spaces of Palestinian life. And it's important to remember, Gaza City is only the latest in a consistent practice of carving up, then hollowing out entire Palestinian cities of any trace of life. It is this strategy of making uninhabitable that makes this renewed forced displacement order different 23 months later. Last week, as it ordered the 1 million residents of Gaza City to leave, Israel indicated a new, quote unquote, humanitarian zone to go to. But this designation, which Israel had used before, had disappeared for 5 months since Israel broke the ceasefire in March 18th. And despite the absence of that, quote unquote, humanitarian zone, Israel continued to order Palestinians to go there and continued to target it. They had targeted it at least 30 times since March. This inconsistency, this lethal outcome of these so-called humanitarian measures tell us they are not only performative, they are lethal, essential to forced displacement, and part of the military strategy itself. We found these boundaries in the past to be consistently and constantly changing when it suited the objectives and narratives of Israel, and were also repeatedly attacked. This new September 6th humanitarian zone also overlaps with what I had just shown you and contradicts those previous evacuation orders and the announced dangerous combat area. That means most of this quote unquote humanitarian zone is within and part of a no-go zone. When we look closer at the shape of this zone, we see it as the leftover space of those military corridors which carve up Gaza. Those corridors are also tied to Israel's new aid system, which what I would like to talk about now. In a report we published last month with Alex Duvall, a leading scholar on famine, we found that Israel has imposed a deadly system by design through the so-called humanitarian foundation, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, at these ration stations, while dismantling simultaneously a proven civilian-led model of aid. We concluded that genocidal means to concentrate Palestinians in the south as part of an announced plan of forced displacement and as part of an effort to push Gazan society toward collapse. The IPC has since declared famine in Gaza City. First, the dismantling of the UN-led civilian system. Israel has dismantled this model by continuing to destroy essential aid infrastructure and by creating conditions for more likely diversions and looting. Each of these incidents are verified attacks on warehouses, bakeries, restaurants, and public kitchens. And this is a continuation, we must emphasize, of what we've seen for the past 23 months, that Israel has targeted civilian sites and systems of aid delivery when and where they became relied on. By this time last year, in our recent report, Israel had attacked aid 322 times. Israel's attacks on civilian, UN-led infrastructure has meant that what little assistance does enter Gaza, is vulnerable to interception, including by gangs it supports, and in spaces it controls. By destroying the civilian infrastructure to facilitate aid, it manufactures a designed chaos around the trucks entering Gaza. The second part of the system, in place of the UN model, is a militarized model under the GHF, a system made up of 4 ration stations meant to serve 2 million people. And there's a few points to understand about the system. First, all 4 stations are separated from the north of Gaza, giving no way to access them without permanent displacement. Second, civilians who are able to reach the GHF stations may have to walk up to 6 hours to collect aid. Third, GHF opening hours made aid inaccessible by design. We analyzed these opening hours over a period of 5 weeks and found in almost a third of the cases, the stations were closed before they announced to be open. And that those announcements of opening were made an average of 17 minutes in advance. And that they had stayed open for an average of only 10 minutes. Fourth, GHF stations are embedded within military infrastructure and are lethal in themselves, with repeated incidents of civilians directly attacked while seeking aid at these sites. The combination of these rare openings and the distance of the stations has meant people are forced to set up camp closer to them, even in evacuation or no-go zones. In fact, those ration stations are all within no-go zones declared by Israel, designing a scenario of double risk. Either risk your life by leaving this quote-unquote humanitarian zone, or starve. This compounds with Israel's destruction of agriculture, which destroys Palestinian ability to provide for themselves. While destroying the social and physical fabric of Gaza, Israeli leadership has spoken openly about mass displacement, which is permanent, of Palestinians. And the same consultants responsible for the militarized aid system are planning reconstruction and forced displacement. This recent plan, this Riviera plan, not only seeks to profit from the destruction of Gaza. For us, we see it as a continuation of genocide by other means, a plan which is predicated and dependent on eliminating Palestinians from Gaza. This plan is also importantly spatially similar to the so-called Arab plan announced in March, which was endorsed by the EU. It's another plan which was imposed without Palestinian involvement and embeds the architecture of genocide within it. Our analysis of this plan shows that it mirrors Israel's military infrastructure, including the buffer zone, military corridors, and routes for military raids. It is built on the blueprint of military control, carving up and hollowing out Gaza. Any reconstruction plan imposed onto Palestinians has within it a genocidal logic, and any reconstruction which is just must be a Palestinian-led one. I will conclude by saying what we are seeing now in Gaza City, it's forced displacement, continuous bombing and destruction and famine, alongside an aid system which destroys civilian aid distribution and replaces it with a deadly militarized model, are part of wider and long-term patterns of Israeli military conduct. Genocide is a process and a relation between events. It's not a singular act or any set of singular acts. It is a culmination of overlapping and cumulative actions of a state. And it's important for us to recognize that if the conduct of the Israeli military was, as they say, responsive to live combat, what we would see in the spatial evidence is actions which are unique in form and random in their timing and space. Instead, what we see is a concerted effort of actions consistent in form and sequence, and which are compounded and concentrated in space and time to make Gaza uninhabitable. We do not see random and spontaneous incidents. We see a planned and calculated campaign to destroy Palestinian life, the conditions necessary for life. These are patterns of genocide. What is happening now is a continuation of that pattern. And in the absence of real action, MPs must bring the spatial evidence alongside the testimonies of Palestinian witnesses to the Canadian public and Canadian leadership. Meanwhile, Palestinian human rights organizations documenting what is happening on the ground, including Al-Haq, Al-Mizan, and the Palestinian Center for Human Rights, are being sanctioned by the US, and Canada must stand by them and support them. Thank you. Now, Emilio will present a short legal analysis on this work.
Hello again. In the past 2 days, the Legal Center for Palestine and Forensic Architecture, Omar and myself, have met with a number of MPs here. We have shown them this shocking data, and we have called them to take action. We have responded also to, I would say, to two main questions that these MPs were asking us. The first one, and I want to take a minute, because I think it's central to the political debate today in Canada regarding Gaza, is when does the obligation to prevent genocide come into being? To those arguing that Canada's obligation to prevent genocide has not been triggered because we do not know positively that a genocide is taking place in Gaza, as there has been no court determination in this respect yet, the International Court of Justice itself has answered the issue in the case of Bosnia-Serbia by saying that genocide does not need to be happening to engage the duty to prevent. For the court, and I quote the court, to say that the obligation to prevent genocide only comes into being when perpetration of genocide commences would be, and these are the words of the court, absurd, since the whole point of the obligation is to prevent or attempt to prevent the occurrence of the act. In this case, the same case, the court considered that the only requirement to trigger the obligation to prevent genocide is that the state in question learns of or should normally have learned of the existence of a serious risk that genocide will be committed. Well, the decision of the ICJ on 26th of January 2024 regarding the demand of South Africa for provisional measures in her case of genocide against Israel undoubtedly trigger third state's responsibility to prevent genocide in Gaza under Article 1 of the Genocide Convention, particularly considering that the ICJ's decision has not been the only warning given to the international community about the plausibility of a genocide taking place in Gaza. Now, the MPs asks us also, what has been Canada's position in other cases of genocide? And we wanted to highlight that it's extremely shocking that despite having an important political, economic, and military relationship with Israel, and therefore a strong leverage, Canada has taken no meaningful measures to prevent the genocide in Gaza. This is especially outrageous given that Canada has acknowledged, understood, and frequently fulfilled its obligations under the Genocide Convention in other cases. For instance, and I finish with this, in the case of Myanmar, Canada denounced the genocide perpetrated against the Rohingya minority and intervened in the proceedings for genocide instituted by Gambia against Myanmar in the ICJ in November 2019. In its joint declaration, Canada expressed and pushed for a very flexible position regarding the interpretation of the Genocide Convention, the qualification of the alleged acts of genocide as such, and the evaluation of evidence required special genocidal intent. In this case, Canada not only intervened in the proceedings, but also provided humanitarian assistance to victims and called for the perpetrators to be held accountable. None of these measures has seriously been adopted by Canada in regard to Palestinian victims in Gaza, not even when they are Canadian citizens. Canada adopted the same prosecution-friendly positions in the cases of Ukraine, Russia, and others. However, and despite that in the case of Gaza, a far clearer case of genocide is taking place, Canada has failed to adopt the same position or to put in place any meaningful measure to prevent genocide. Concrete steps are available now. Suspend armed transfers and related cooperation, enforce laws against foreign enlistment, review trade and financial relationships, and seize any aid or assistance that helps maintain this unlawful situation. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could tell me who were the MPs you met with, which parties were they from?
Honestly, I cannot identify the names. We met liberal MPs, we met NDP MPs yesterday and today.
Did they seem to have any interest in pursuing the avenues you mentioned through legislative means, through parliament, perhaps?
Yes, absolutely. Actually, the questions they were asking us were related to very concrete measures that Canada could take. And they were asking this, what can we do? Omar offered them to, because we think this is important, that this information and this data is shown to the Canadian public and to the Canadian leadership so that they can respond in front of what seems to us clear evidence of a genocidal intent. We gave them some ideas and we decided, we agreed on continue working together to find ways of doing so.
Can you be more specific with which ideas you gave them?
Yes, the ones that I just mentioned. So stop the fundraising for Israeli institution and Israeli army in Canada, stop foreign enlistment in Canada, which is prohibited by Canadian law, support the prosecution of people, Canadian included, that are involved in war crimes in Gaza, review trade agreements that have human rights clauses there and allow Canada to take measures, etc., etc. I think the Canadian public, the Canadian leadership, and the MPs are very perfectly aware of the things and the measures and the actions that Canada could take. The problem that we have is that they are not doing so. And this is why we are bringing evidence, data that somehow it seems to me irrefutable and that could push them to fulfill their obligations. Remembering that the obligation to prevent genocide was triggered a long time ago. We don't know exactly what the Canadian leadership is waiting for.
And this idea of a two-way arms embargo, as you know, it's been circulating within a lot of activist circles for a while now, and the government's response continues to be, we're not shipping munitions to Israel. We're not doing that. So how do you square that circle?
Well, I think the public is aware today that the Canadian government has been at least very ambiguous about the export of weapons to Israel. Some time ago, they announced the stopping of this trade with Israel, but we know that there are other ways in which military equipment from Canada is reaching the Israeli army, basically through the export, I'm sure you know that, of pieces of military equipment that go first to the US and from the US directly to Israel, which are not registered as a Canadian export to Israel. Okay?
Thank you. This concludes the press conference. Merci. C'est ce qui conclut cette conférence de presse.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.